Welcome back, deep divers, ready for another fascinating plunge into, well, fascinating stuff. Today we're diving right into the King James Bible, specifically the book of Daniel. It's right there in the Books of the Bible list on the website where our source material is, by the way.
Absolutely. So this deep dive, it's all about giving you a solid grasp of this, monumentally important book. Who wrote it, when, and why it still resonates today. Think of it as like a guided tour through Daniel's world.
Yeah, totally. And our source material, it's a gold mine. We've got all the chapters, of course, plus this fantastic summary that digs into the potential author, the date it was written, questions about its authenticity, all the big theological themes, the writing style, even a full outline.
It's all there.
So we're going to use all of that, pull it all together to give you a complete but easy to understand picture of this book.
Sounds good.
Okay, so first things first, the structure. Our source neatly lays it out, 12 chapters, plus that helpful summary. And right away you see a cool division based on, like, the writing style. Chapters 1 through 6, they're mostly historical narrative.
Yeah, storytelling, like real events stories.
Right, those classic stories like Daniel and his buddies in Babylon navigating those, the royal courts, facing those crazy trials, the fiery furnace, the lion's den, gripping stuff.
Exactly. But then when you hit chapters 7 through 12, mostly, the style shifts. It becomes what's called apocalyptic literature.
Whoa, apocalyptic. Sounds intense.
It can be, but it's more than just, end-of-the-world stuff. It's a way of writing, using symbolism, visions, prophecy. It pops up often when things are tough, to give hope to God's people by focusing on the future. Eschatology, the study of the end times.
Gotcha. So first half, more historical, grounded. Second half, more symbolic, looking ahead. Okay, that makes sense. Now, who wrote this thing and when? The summary points out that the book itself seems to say Daniel is the author, right? Passages like Daniel 9.2 and 10.2.
Right, that's a good starting point. And think about this, even Jesus acknowledges Daniel as a prophet. Our source mentions Matthew 24.15, where Jesus talks about the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel. He's quoting Daniel 9.27 there. That lends some serious weight to the idea of Daniel being the author, historically speaking.
For sure. And the date. The source suggests around 530 BC, after Cyrus the Great took over Babylon in 539 BC, so 6th century BC.
That's the traditional view, yeah. But the summary also brings up what's called the late date view. This idea says Daniel was written much later, during the Maccabean period, 2nd century BC. And the reason they think that is often because they have a problem with the idea of, like, detailed prophecy, predicting the future so far ahead. So anytime it seems like Daniel got something right about the future, they say, well, it must have been written after it happened to make it look like prophecy.
So, like, they're saying it was written backward, basically, to fit the events.
Kind of, yeah. But our source lays out some pretty strong counter-arguments to that late-date idea, and they're all based on actual evidence. This is where things get really interesting, understanding the context of the book.
Hit me with it.
All right, so let's start with the 4 empires in Daniel, chapters 2 and 7. The late-date folks, they usually say these are Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. And they do that to try and make the 4th empire match up with the Greek powers around during the Maccabean time.
Trying to fit the pieces, huh? But the source has a different take, based on what the book itself says, right?
Absolutely. They point out that in Daniel's own writing, the Medes and Persians, they're treated as one thing, the Second Kingdom. Like in Daniel 5.28, even in the description in 2.3243.
So it's not separate, like Media, then Persia. It's one combined Medo-Persian empire.
Exactly. That makes way more sense with the actual timeline, too, leading up to and past the 6th century BC. Babylon, Medo-Persian Empire as one, the Greeks, then the Romans as the 4 kingdoms.
Right. Trying to force Media in there as a separate thing seems kind of off, going by the text itself. What else does the source say?
Well, the language used in the book, that gives us some clues, too. The source talks about linguistic evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Those ancient scrolls.
Yeah, those. They show us real examples of Hebrew and Aramaic from, like, the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. And when scholars compare the language in the scrolls to the Hebrew and Aramaic parts of Daniel, they see that Daniel's language is more like, older stuff from centuries before the Maccabean period.
Like the way people wrote back then was different.
Yeah, it's like, language changes over time, words, grammar, slang, all that. And Daniel's writing, it just doesn't match the style of the 2nd century BC based on other writing from that time.
Wow, that's pretty neat how language can pinpoint the time period like that.
Yeah, and it goes even further. The source points out that even the Persian and Greek words sprinkled through Daniel, they don't mean it has to be from a later date. Some specific terms in chapter 3, they were already getting less common by the 2nd century BC, even becoming like old-fashioned. And the guys who translated the Septuagint, that old Greek translation of the Old Testament, they actually mistranslated some of those words. That suggests those words weren't commonly used anymore by their time. If Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC, you'd think the author would have used more up-to-date words that people understood.
Right, like why use words no one knows anymore, unless it was written when those words were still around, of course. That's cool.
It is. It's a little detailed, but it's strong evidence. And then there's the prophecies in Daniel that weren't fulfilled by the 2nd century BC. That goes right against the idea that it was written after those things supposedly happened.
So what's an example of one of those prophecies?
Well, the fourth kingdom in Daniel, it's described as this super powerful destructive force. You see it in 2.33 and 7.719, and that lines up really well with the Roman Empire. But the Romans didn't really control the Syro-Palestine area until 63 BC, way after the supposed late date for Daniel.
Yeah, the timing is off if it was written in the 2nd century.
Right, and then there's the prophecy about the anointed one, the ruler, in Daniel 9.25-27. It gives a specific time frame, something like 483 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And that lines up pretty convincingly with the time of Jesus' ministry. That's way outside the Maccabean period, too.
Okay, so all those pieces together, the empires, the language, the prophecies that go past the 2nd century BC, it seems like the source is making a pretty strong case for Daniel being the author, writing it back in the 6th century.
That's what they conclude, yeah. They say the evidence points to the traditional view of authorship and dating.
All right, so we've covered the structure, the author, the date. Now, what's the big message of the book of Daniel? What's the central theme, theologically speaking?
Well, our source says the main theme is stated really clearly in 2 verses, Daniel 4.17 and 5.21. And that theme is the absolute sovereignty of God over all the kingdoms of the earth. The text says the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men. And that's not just a side note, it's the foundation of the whole book. And think about how powerful that message would have been for the people hearing this for the first time, living through the rise and fall of these huge empires.
Yeah, that's a big deal, right? Like, no matter what's happening in the world, God is still in control.
Exactly. And it's not just a one-time thing either. The source emphasizes that all through Daniel's visions, God is shown as the ultimate winner. Like passages like 7.11, 26:27, 8.25, and 9.27, they all declare God's power and victory.
And the source even links this to the New Testament, Revelation 11.15. What's the connection there?
Yeah, it shows how this idea continues throughout the whole Bible. That verse in Revelation says, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever." And it links right back to those key passages in Daniel, like 2.44 and 7.27. So it's a consistent message from Old Testament to New Testament. God's sovereignty is forever.
So no matter how crazy the world gets, empires rising and falling, the message is God's plan, God's authority, that's what wins in the end. That must have been incredibly reassuring for the original audience.
For sure. Now, to give you a map of what's actually in the book, let's go through the outline from the summary. It's divided into 3 main sections.
All right, lay it on me.
Okay, first section is the prologue, just chapter 1. This sets the scene, introduces the Babylonian captivity of Daniel and his friends, and it really emphasizes their faithfulness to God, even in a foreign, potentially dangerous place. And it shows how that faithfulness leads to them being promoted, getting some influence in the Babylonian court. It sets the stage for everything that follows.
Okay, so chapter 1, it's like the foundation, introducing everyone, the challenges, and the importance of faith.
Exactly. Then we have the second section, chapters 2 through 7, called The Destinies of the Nations of the World. This is where you find some of the most famous stories from Daniel, like Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the giant statue representing different kingdoms, him building that golden statue and forcing everyone to worship it, and of course Daniel in the lion's den. You also have Daniel's own dream of the 4 beasts coming out of the sea. That's a major apocalyptic vision, showing how empires will rise and fall from God's perspective.
Wow, so this section is all about world history on a grand scale and how God is involved in the fate of these empires. Those dreams and stories are pretty vivid too.
Yeah, definitely. And finally come to the third section, chapters 8 through 12, titled The Destiny of the Nation of Israel. The summary points out that these chapters are in Hebrew, different from the earlier parts. This is where you find Daniel's prophecies specifically about Israel's future. The vision of the ram and the goat, the prophecy of the 77s, which has been debated and interpreted for centuries. And then those last chapters, they get really detailed, really symbolic, with a vision outlining Israel's whole future. Prophecies about Persia, Greece, Egypt, Syria, the Antichrist, a time of huge trouble, and then God's deliverance, even the resurrection of the dead.
So we go from a wide view of empires to a focused look at Israel's destiny. And the writing gets more intense, more symbolic as it goes along.
Exactly. It goes from those early narrative stories to these powerful symbolic prophecies as it unfolds. It's like the style shifts as the focus moves towards the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan.
That's a cool progression. So, wrapping up our deep dive here, we've gone through the book of Daniel in the King James Bible, using all the info from our source. We saw the structure, historical stories transitioning to those apocalyptic visions. We looked at the evidence for Daniel being the author way back in the 6th century BC, and the main message, God's sovereignty over everything. And we walked through the outline of the book from Babylon all the way to those future prophecies about empires in Israel.
It's a book with layers, captivating stories of faith and courage, but also profound ideas about God's plan, his control over history. It's got it all.
It really does. And seeing how Daniel combines those historical accounts with those future-looking prophecies, it makes you think, right, what does that say about how time works, how God's plan unfolds, as we see in this ancient text? Maybe this deep dive has sparked something in you. Maybe you want to go back and revisit some of those specific chapters or prophecies that really stood out to you. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep pondering those big questions.
See that.